Hello, I'm Wayne Smutz, Dean of UCLA Extension. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, those here in the auditorium as well as those on technology today. This is a very special event focused on economic forecasts for the United States and for California economies. It's a first of its kind event for us, bringing together UCLA Extension instructors at the same time and made possible through the utilization of today's technology. It's been put together to benefit our 2,000 plus instructors here at UCLA Extension through a collaborative effort of Extension's business management and legal programs and the UCLA Anderson School of Management. I'm new to this role of dean as of about 6-7 weeks ago here at UCLA. While a California native, I've spent the last 40 years at Penn State University and the last 6 as head of Penn State's online initiative called the World Campus. I was not looking to leave Penn State, but when UCLA expressed interest, it seemed like just too good of an opportunity to turn down. Why? This is a great institution, as all of you know, to be a part of, one of the best in the world, as a matter of fact. UCLA Extension also has a wonderful reputation and does terrific work. The higher education context is changing dramatically as new technologies are pressing all of us to rethink teaching and learning in significant ways. There is much opportunity for innovation and creative work. And finally, this is Los Angeles, a dynamic, vital city, and yet one that has tremendous needs that UCLA and UCLA Extension in particular can help address. Oh, and did I mention it's going to snow tonight in Pennsylvania? I'm glad not to be there. Only because of the weather, though. And I must say that I've had an extremely warm welcome by everyone here at UCLA. While I'm mostly listening and learning now, I look forward over the next few months to working with staff and others to begin to shape a vision for UCLA Extension for the future, one that places us on the path to being the kind of extraordinary extension unit that UCLA, Los Angeles, and indeed California and the nation need for the 21st century. But first things first, this is today, and today I'm pleased to be introducing this event in one of my first formal roles as the dean here, really for several reasons. First, instructors are the lifeblood of UCLA Extension. Without your expertise, dedication, and commitment, we could not possibly serve the needs of the many individuals who want access to a UCLA education. So thank you for your great work. This is a day of appreciation for all of you to go along with an opportunity for your personal and professional development in this session that we're going to have today. Second, though, I'm pleased to be introducing this event because it's a collaboration between the Anderson School of Management and UCLA Extension. When we can make these kinds of collaborative efforts work, everybody wins. And today, I think we're all winners. One of my key areas of focus here at UCLA will be building stronger bonds between Extension and the campus so that we can do more events like this and other kinds of things as well. Separately, we can be very good. Together, I think we can actually be extraordinary. Third, this event represents the type of experience that must become more and more prevalent in the learning context, a combination of the face-to-face environment and the use of technology. I am not a cult follower of online technology, I must admit, but I truly believe that technology can improve both access and learning. If we ignore the advances in educational technology and the opportunity to try innovative and creative solutions, we put at risk our institutions and indeed our own professional lives. So Roger, thanks for being willing to put an event like this together and to take a chance and a risk. That's the kinds of things we have to do. Fourth, the economy, whether it is in good shape or bad, has a significant impact on those of us who work in post-secondary education. It creates the context in which we all must work, in which we all must plan, strategize, and execute. So it's important that we all understand it. Fortunately today, we are honored, and I do mean truly honored, to have with us 2 faculty from the Anderson School of Management who are going to do just that, help us understand the economic landscape. Let me introduce them now, and we'll get going. First, Ed Leamer is director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, which provides quarterly economic projections for the nation and the state of California. Dr. Leamer is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Economic Metrics Society, and was a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He has served on the Council of Economic Advisors of both Governor Pete Wilson and Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Jerry Nickelsburg, senior economist at the Anderson Forecast, plays a role in the economic modeling and forecasting of the national and California economies in the Los Angeles, Bay Area, and Southern California economies. He has conducted special studies into the future of manufacturing in Los Angeles, the distribution of income, the aerospace industry, the undocumented construction and manufacturing labor force, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and the garment industry. So now you know why we are so honored to have these two faculty members from the Anderson School. Let me also take a moment to introduce our UCLA Extension Instructor panel. And they are ones who will pose questions to our two professors later in the session. Our panel members are Nance Rosen, who is a marketing instructor, James McDade, who is with our legals programs, and it looks like just on time, Natalie Pedoff, who is with our public relations and social media instructor. So with that, let's get the show going, and Professor Leamer, it's yours.
Thank you very much. It's altogether fitting that we have this event, a collaboration between UCLA Anderson Forecast and the UCLA Extension. By its very title, what UCLA Extension does is it extends the brand and the intellectual assets of UCLA beyond the borders of the campus. And we're very much engaged at the Forecast, very much engaged in exactly the same thing. We try to reach out not just to the Los Angeles, but really to around the globe via the media to communicate the things that are going on here at the Anderson School when it comes to thinking about where the economy is and where it's going. And so it's ideal to explore a new way of extending that knowledge through the internet and through this kind of event. And I'm hopeful, and I think very much it's the case, this will be the first of many explorations in these new technologies that will help both organizations and help UCLA in particular to reach out beyond the edge of the campus. So with that said, I want to bring up my introductory slides. So you're going to see a lot of pictures of me. That's another image of me here. But I remind you, in case you don't know, what we do at the UCLA Anderson Forecast is we issue quarterly forecasts for the nation, for California and Los Angeles. Those things are released in a forecast event. Our plan, our intent is not to just give you the numbers, but to give you the explanation, give you the why of the forecast. And our goal is to make sure if you come to our forecast, you're spending your precious time with us, usually a whole morning, you walk away with something that is more valuable than that time, that precious time that you committed. And in part, in order to achieve that goal, we do the forecast, but we also have a theme for each one of these events. We often do real estate, but the most recent two events, the one in September was about workforce development. And our view is the sluggishness of the economy that we're experiencing, the sluggishness of the labor market, isn't because of weakness in demand. It isn't because the Federal Reserve ought to do another one of these QE programs. It isn't because we need another fiscal stimulus. Oh, yeah, you don't have me on here. Okay, Scott, I'm sorry about that. A little bit of a snafu there. Just switch microphones in case you wondered what happened just now. So our take on a weakness in the economy is not because of demand problems. It has to do with now we got a terrible echo. It has to do with inadequacy of workforce development. So as on Bloomberg News, and we're talking about Los Angeles, and I brought to the attention of the interviewers that Los Angeles is one of the few cities around the United States that has had negative job growth since 1990. Between now compared to 1990, LA is the very worst. And can you name the other two? Well, Detroit might come to mind. That's one. The other one is Cleveland. So my comment is that Detroit and Cleveland have rusting factories. LA doesn't have rusting factories. We have rusting schools, meaning we have a tremendous workforce development problem here in LA. In order to get this economy rolling again, we think the focus ought to be on the schools and a whole workforce development process. And and today, or yesterday, we had an event that focused on savings. Americans don't realize it, but they're growing older, and we're not saving nearly enough to fund the retirements of the baby boomers, let alone the next generation. So I'm going to be playing two videos that have to do with those two ideas that we just talked about, workforce development, and I'm going to do one video, and then you have me in live. But before we get to that, I just want to lay out our short-term forecast that we issued yesterday. We think that if we can get Washington to calm down a little bit, the economy will be on a 3% growth path next year, a little bit better than this year. We're like a 2 or 2.5 economy. We think we're going to be 3%. The employment picture is improving. In fact, yesterday we said we'd be getting 200,000 new jobs each month. And the release this very day, it was almost exactly 200,000. Perhaps it was 203. So that's good news. That's a little bit more than normal, and it signals a better economy ahead for 2014. We think the news is the Fed is going to have to start backing off its very aggressive monetary policy, and that the tapering is going to come a little sooner than a lot of people expect. We say early 2015, but we think that that is likely to come a little sooner. And everybody better worry about inflation. So our inflation forecast is just modestly above this consensus, but the situation, a foundation for very serious inflation has been laid, and we're worried about when that's going to come to fruition. So now we're going to talk about these two longer-term concerns that I've already mentioned. The first is workforce development. The secondly is the need for increased national savings. And workforce development is about designing the intellectual assets for the reality of the post-industrial age. National savings is making sure that we have enough savings to fund the retirements of the baby boomers and the generations after that. So the first item of business is this video. This video was taken in September when our conference focused on workforce development issues. And then after that, you'll see me live with regard to retirement. So we're going to play this video. Okay, so David used this word, return to normalcy. And the bond market has not yet returned, but it's promising to return to normal. But the labor market is so far from normal. It's the American worker is in a world of hurt. Let me try to illustrate how that, what the facts that lie behind that statement are. This is a slide that you've seen before. This is the payroll jobs compared to the previous peak. And it looks like we're going to be back to that previous peak in the mid part of next year, but that's not the standard. It's not back to where we were, but back to where we should be. And this next slide illustrates that. Compared to the trend, we're about 15 million jobs short. Compared to trends, the jobs are about 11%. So don't put your party hat on just because we got back to that where we were, because the labor market is in a world of hurt right now. And you can see the unemployment has declined, and maybe you want to put your party hat on with regard to that. But the reality is that that decline in that unemployment rate is all because of discouraged workers, a decline in labor force participation. If you look at what's relevant, which is the employment to population ratio, it plummeted in that recession of 2009, and since then it's been basically flat. There's been no improvement in that employment to population ratio. So this is a highly abnormal. There's been no recovery. We had a discussion a minute ago about whether there was a recovery, and we talked about the beginning of the recovery. There's been no recovery. There's been an end of recession, but no recovery. Recovery is a period of time of exceptional growth where you put Americans back to work, and we haven't had that this time. There's been absolutely no recovery whatsoever. In addition to the totals being troubling, the details are troubling too. So you have the jobs organized at the bottom are the goods-related jobs, and the intellectual services, and at the top of the service sector jobs. So the goods jobs, which are the traditional foundational jobs, are manufacturing and construction. they are hugely negative. There's been no recovery. We lost a heck of a lot of jobs. Those are the foundation. Most communities build their economy around those foundational jobs. Those are the jobs that create the product that can be exported outside your region historically. And if not that, maybe some of these intellectual services are going to serve as a foundation as well. But even those are weak. So where the job has been strong is in healthcare and restaurants, leisure and hospitality. Well, that's not a recipe for long-term economic growth. We can't grow the economy feeding each other meals and taking care of our health problems. We need those foundation jobs. So not only are the headline numbers troubling, the details are very troubling as well. So then another aspect that's troubling is the employment to population ratio of the kids are at all-time lows. So that's the 16 to 17-year-olds. It used to be 30% would have jobs, and now it's down to a number that we've never seen before. I'm proud to say my first job was a dishwasher at Howard Johnson's when I was 16 years old. And I did such a good job, I got promoted to busboy. And when I was a kid, all the 16 and 17-year-old kids were out there working at these menial jobs. You really learned a lot in those first jobs. Well, our kids today don't have that. It's a huge workforce development issue. So it's not just the young kids. The 18 to 19-year-olds were setting record low employment to population ratios of the 18 to 19-year-olds. Now the 20 to 24-year-olds are a little better. You can see that in the historical record we've had employment to population ratios that were comparable to today, but still you have to go way back to the 60s to see the incredible troubled labor market for the kids. In addition, another troubling thing, education doesn't give you the projection that it used to. So this is employment to population by education. The BA and above was hard hit in the recession of 2000, where the high school graduates, or less than high school graduates, went through that recession like it wasn't there. So that was like an upside down. Usually it's sort of first in, first out. It's those lowest paid, least skilled workers who are suffering recessions. That was the way it wasn't true in the 2001. And this time it's an equal opportunity kind of downturn, meaning that you have these sharp declines in employment to population ratios at every level of education, including the bachelor's degree. So the bachelor's degree in the 20th century is no longer a sure thing of not losing a job the way it was in the 21st century. It's no longer a sure thing the way it was in the 20th century. So our view is that the sluggishness in the economy has very little to do with aggregate demand. It has nothing to do with another fiscal stimulus from Washington. It has nothing to do with the QEX, whatever the latest policy is, the interest rates. It's a fundamental workforce development problem. We do not have a workforce that's suited to the reality of the 21st century. And look for clues that back up this viewpoint. The critical thing you need to know is that we've had 11 recessions since World War II, and in the first 11 there have been recoveries in the job market. The last 3 there have not been recoveries. So the message is, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, don't think of this episode as different. Think of the last 3 as different. So let's take a look at that. We're going to look at the payroll jobs. There's the normal payroll growth at 1.5% per year. This is what happened following the 1948 peak in November 1948. You can see that we lost about 5% of jobs within 12 months. We got those back within another 6 or 7 months, and by the end of 2 years, we were back to that trend growth. That's a recovery. Getting back to that trend is a real recovery. So that's the 53 downturn, that's 57, 60, 69, 73, 80, 81. They all have the same shape, meaning that you lose 2 or 3% of the jobs, maybe 4 or 5, depending upon the depth of the downturn. But by the end of 2 years, you're back to where you were before, and by the end of 3 years, you had a real recovery, you got back to that trend rate of growth. Now we're going to look at the last 3 recessions. So there's the trend growth. That's the average of the first 8. Here's the 1990 downturn, and it chugged along below the trend line. It got back to that trend line when we had the internet rush, and we had the big employment gains as a consequence of the internet rush. That's a 2000 downturn. And you can see there's no recovery there. We percolate along below the 1% trend indefinitely. And here we are now. And granted, by the middle of next year, we're going to be back to where we were, but we're moving parallel to that line. It's like we lost a bunch of jobs and we're not getting any of those back. There's these missing jobs that if we had a real recovery, we'd be converging back to that 1% trend. So to think about it, you got to realize, to unravel what's going on, that the last three have been different. So you think you're Sherlock Holmes and you try to solve this case, that's a critical factor. There's a lot of smoke about how uncertainty that arises from Washington, D.C. is the reason that we have a sluggish job market. Well, the same thing, we had a sluggish job market the last two recessions. Was there a lot of uncertainty coming from Washington, D.C. and all of them? So anyway, let's look at what I think is critical, a critical component of this story, which is in manufacturing. The cycles, the downturns, have to do with postponing purchases. The ultimate postponable items are durables, which are homes and cars. You don't need a new home, you don't need a new car. If the economy's troubled, you postpone that, and that means a lot of trouble for manufacturing. Most of the job loss traditionally is in manufacturing and construction. So you see manufacturing right here in front of you, and the red verticals represent the recessions, and these are all labeled with V's. These V's are the shapes of the recessions, where you lose a couple million jobs, and you get them all back within a year and a half. Temporary layoffs followed by recalls. Temporary layoffs followed by recalls has been the pattern until the 1990 event, which was a U-shaped kind of phenomenon in manufacturing. It wasn't until you had that internet rush that you really got the jobs back in manufacturing. But 2000, we lost 2.5 million jobs and none of them came back. Absolutely none. So the difference is those are permanent displacements. Temporary layoffs means you just have to hang around, you're going to get your job back. Permanent displacements mean you're going to have to that worker has to choose probably a new location, new skills, and most important of all, new aspirations, because they're going to go from a manufacturing job that gave them a quality middle-class American life to something that doesn't. And that's tough, and that's not amenable to fiscal or monetary policy. It really needs workforce development that's focused on those manufacturing workers who lost all those jobs. We've got to figure out what they can do to get back to decent American pay again. And the critical thing is, it has to do, I can't see that, huh? You meant to, we had a secular trend until about 1980, and then we have this secular downturn since 1980. It's that trend that changes the nature of the cycle for the following reason. These downturns always involve cost cutting, which you lay off a bunch of workers, you don't hire them all back because you get a productivity improvement that comes from laying off the least productive workers. But if you take that cost cutting, you add to that a positive trend, then you get the nice V-shaped cycle, which is temporary layoffs followed by recalls. But if you take the cost cutting and add to that a negative trend, then you get the lazy L that we've been having. And that's tough. That requires workforce development. It requires special training and education for those workers who have been displaced so that they can get decent jobs again. In addition, there's a construction, excess capacity in construction. There's probably 1.5 million workers there, 2 million workers in manufacturing. But the thing that I worry about most isn't those jobs, but the role that microprocessors are playing. In the 1960s, the HR departments, especially in manufacturing, started to have a line of robots, a long line of robots offering to do the work that humans used to do. And they broke a lot of things back then, but the robots are getting a lot better than they used to be. But it was the 80s, really, where the low-wage foreigners were applying for American jobs, but now it's a microprocessor. Every day I walk around, there's another piece of equipment that's doing a job that a human used to do. And if you're a worker, you do not want to compete with robots, with low-wage foreigners, or with microprocessors, because all those folks are willing to work long hours in crummy conditions for low wages. So we want an American workforce that doesn't have to face that kind of competition. How do you isolate your workforce? By education. You create a trained, educated workforce. I like to say in the 20th century, jobs were created by the entrepreneurs and financiers. And the jobs in the 21st century are created by teachers, because those teachers are embodying in their kids the skills and attitudes that will allow them to find decent work in the 21st century. So this is an image of the microprocessor at work. This is kind of an MBA slide, so if you understand it, you're going to get an MBA at the end of the presentation. But the horizontal axis shows you the total hours. That's the input, total hours worked in the U.S. economy. And the vertical axis is the amount of output. So I'm about ready to show you the actual data, but you're supposed to have an image of the data moving in a northeasterly direction as both hours and output are increasing over time. But in addition, that line is going to cross these lines of constant productivity, which are the rays that come out of the origin. But also, you notice the shape of the cost cutting. Every one of these economic cycles has the cost cutting that looks like that big blue arrow, which has a lot more decline in hours at the beginning of the downturn. You're laying off a lot of workers, a lot more decline in hours than you get in output. That's a productivity improvement that always comes with that cost cutting. And then you turn around up and running and you're hiring workers and you're increasing output both at the same time. So this is the 1948 event. And you can see that it begins with that little cost-cutting cycle at the beginning, and then you're up and running. Hope you're getting this. So this is 53. That's 57. That's the 60s. We're getting higher productivity, more output, more input, more output. 73, 80. That's the long 80. Now, this is the first one that's different. That's the 1990 cycle. You can see there's a bigger cost-cutting wiggle there. Something was happening with regard to the labor market that allowed firms to do more extreme cost-cutting in that 1990 event. Then the 2000 event has an extreme cost-cutting cycle. And now we're in another one of those extreme cost-cutting cycles. And that has the microprocessor. Firms are starting to realize how they can use information technology, and instead of hiring back the workers or hiring additional workers, they're using equipment to do the jobs that humans used to do. So it's not just cost cutting that is worrisome in this picture. You see that we had job growth, hours growth, and output growth pretty much steady through the 20th century. But in the 20th century, it's been all output and no hours. Humans are so unnecessary because we have the equipment doing the work. That's what this slide is saying. So if you want to get hours growing again, you've got to have a workforce that can compete effectively against those three sources of competition, which means we need workforce development. So what's the solution? Training and education. Training is what Pavlov does to his dogs. So there's a lot of that goes on in the classrooms. I'm sure I could get you barking at the end of the quarter with regard to macroeconomic issues. And then you get trained. But the problem is computers can get trained way better than humans can. So if all you're doing is embodying programmed learning when you're in a class, you're getting nothing that's useful in the labor markets of the 21st century. The education means you graduate with attitudes, understanding, love of learning. Education is the student's responsibility. The educator sets up possibilities, but the students have to take responsibility for their own education, not the instructor. The instructor sets up the possibilities. So this is humans like linear man-made things. You want to see where humans are in the universe, you look for the straight lines. And whereas nature is chaotic, nonlinear, beautiful, it's organized in a different way. Training is linear, man-made, organized. The faculty member is an instructor. Think of it as a computer programmer. That faculty person is trying to program the student to make the appropriate responses. But education is totally different. Education is chaotic, nonlinear, natural, experiential, unpredictable, self-organizing. A faculty, a teacher, who's an educator, is a coach. And I really believe the best educators on campus are our coaches, because you can find out how well they're doing on a weekend-by-weekend basis. And they're not giving lectures for those kids. Those athletes don't sit in lecture halls memorizing material to become as good as they are. The faculty should be an advisor. You have a trainer and a trainee are not aligned. A lot of students find it difficult to subject themselves to training. But in education, the educator and the student are aligned. They want together to create the opportunity for the best possible job when they graduate. When you do well, we do well. That's the way it should be. Now I'm going to show you a picture of the two best problem solvers on the West Coast. these are my grandkids. So this is my grandkid some time ago at a science museum. My view is children are these natural problem solvers. So they go to a science museum, they can't figure out some piece of equipment, they don't care. They don't care if somebody else is going to do it faster than they can. They go to another piece of equipment and play with that for a while. And then they come back and play with this thing. That's what we want to have from our high schools and colleges. We want that kid to be still present, still love learning, looking for new problems to solve, rather than being trained and being programmed to get the right answers on the test. You want them to be able to design the test and and solve the puzzles that have not yet been solved. We want that kid to be ever present and throughout our lives, constantly pushing ourselves. Most of us have our spheres of comfort and we stay pretty close inside that. Well, kids are not like that. You've got to push yourself. Try something new. It's really rewarding. An example, how do you learn computer programs? It used to be you had an inch of manuals, you had 2 inches, you had to read all these things, 15, 25. Now it's 0 inches. I don't know how you learn a new computer code, but I load it up and give it a try. I watch some of my friends, how they do it, maybe use a help command. It's very experiential the way I mastered that task. It's not lecture and test. So that to give you my view about why the microprocessor is different, why the personal computer is different, and why it's more ominous in terms of its implications, I like to ask the question, is a personal computer like a forklift or like a microphone? So a forklift is a symptom of the equipment, the innovations in the industrial age. When it has the feature that no matter how strong you are compared to me, if we both get trained to operate that forklift, we can both do the job equally well. So it's a big improvement in productivity, but it tends to eliminate genetic-based differences among workers, a force for equality, good jobs for everybody. The microphone is very different because, I mean, it used to be that if you were a singer, you would have an audience, maximum audience would be about this size. But with a microphone and recording devices, an entertainer can entertain the whole globe. And in that kind of environment, you have extreme inequality. You have the real talented people. They have to work hard. Our Hollywood types are working hard to win that game. But they have inherent talent that it's pretty hard to compete against. Believe me, I'm never going to be an opera singer. I'm never going to be a rap singer either. I mean, there's a kind of genetic talent. So the microphone is different from the forklift because it's a source for huge improvements in productivity, but it tends to amplify the differences. The PC is a little bit of both, but more importantly, it's a second type. There's a fraction of our workforce who really get that technology and can use it to create value, and there's a large number of our kids and our current workforce who are left behind. And maybe education and training isn't going to solve that. Maybe we're going to have to suffer from a highly unequal income distribution going forward and deal with that inequality, not in the workplace, but some other way. So to express in terms of task and compensation, we have mundane codifiable task on one side and creative ambiguous task on the other. Computing a mean, these are MBA type tasks. Computing a mean, that's pretty mundane. Run a regression, not too much more difficult. Designing a persuasive graph, that's hard. I mean, if you're told to design a persuasive graph, neither your boss nor you knows exactly what that task is, because you have to figure out what persuasive is or not. Same thing, writing a persuasive memo. So it used to be in the 60s, you had this increase in compensation for the people who could do the creative, ambiguous tasks, but now it's because the microprocessor is doing all those mundane codifiable tasks, you've got to be pretty far to the right in this image in order to get decent wages. And if you're really far to the right, really a creative individual, you have an incredible opportunity now that you wouldn't have had 2 or 3 decades ago before that PC was on the stage. So my view is we've got grandma teaching a kid how to walk. That's not lecture style and tests. That's experiential learning. And in the upper left, you have the Pavlov teaching the dog to bark at the right time. We need more of that grandma type training, meaning that you make it pretty safe, and then you let the students play and learn on their own. Education, not training. So my view is formal education should emphasize analytical thinking, problem solving, creativity, entrepreneurial behavior. We need more ambiguous experiential education and less classroom lecture style exam oriented training, which gives me now the opportunity to introduce our next speaker. I feel like there ought to be a big sigh, but we're going to move on almost immediately to another set of problems, which are equally concern me. And in a way, a message I'd like to get across is that we're not having a public dialogue about these two critical problems. That the need to improve our educational system in LA has been around for a long time. Yet we can talk about it, but the outcomes are just not good. And the same thing is true for the next set of problems that I'm going to talk about, which are the inadequacy of our national savings. So I'm saying there are these two structural adjustments. We're going to move from an industrial to a post-industrial world. That requires a different kind of workforce development. The other is from a spending society to a saving society. And that requires a substantial adjustments as well. And this is something that we made no progress on. So this is an illustration of net national savings, net of depreciation allowances. And you can see in this image back there in the 50s and 60s, we had about a 10% savings rate. It's zero now. It's zero now. If we were a bunch of young kids, we can get away with it, and we can worry about saving when we get to be 50. But we're not a bunch of young kids anymore. This is a disastrous image. So where does the savings, where's the problem? In which component of the economy does the problem resolve? That's the business net savings, retained earnings. And it's been pretty constant at about 3 or 4% of GDP. So there's no big news when it comes to the business side. This is the personal side. And the personal savings used to be almost 10%. We've let that slough off completely inappropriately. We have poor retirement planning on the part of individuals, and they're letting themselves spend at levels that ignore completely the fact that they're going to get old at one point. But the big problem is Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is we've given Uncle Sam a credit card, and he's out there buying flat screen TVs, taking expensive vacations, buying expensive wines. And we think that it's not our credit card, but it is. All that stuff that Uncle Sam is spending is going to be paid at some point by some future taxpayer. So we've got it. One message is we have to have much higher personal savings. That requires education too. Most people don't have the wisdom to have the financial acumen to decide how much savings is appropriate. We need to help them out. But in addition, we need to rein in every level of government. So a lot of people think that the shift from a saving society, from a spending society to a saving society is going to be hugely problematic because the U.S. consumer represents 2/3 of the economy, and it's been the driving force. And the Keynesian view is we're very dependent on consumers to be the driver, the locomotive to pull the economy forward. Well, so we listen to these stories, but we like to see the facts that lie behind it. So this image is meant to help you see whether jumps in national savings preceded recessions, and in that sense maybe have been a cause. So the vertical line in the middle of this image is the cycle peak. To the left of it is things that came before the cycle peak. To the right are things that came after. And if you look hard, before the cycle peak, there were a couple episodes in which national savings was jumping up. From a Keynesian standpoint, would be a bad thing, but the other 9 don't have that feature at all. So there's very little evidence in this data set that a shift of the U.S. economy in favor of more saving and less spending would tip us into recession. And then secondly, if you look at on a more long-term perspective, you look at the scatter diagram that compares the savings rates compared to growth rates. So a lot of people think if you save, you can't grow. Well, in fact, it was the higher growth rates occurred when we had higher savings rates. And overall, there's a bunch of noise. So the movement from a spending society to a savings society, that doesn't mean we're going to have sluggish economic growth. Particularly if we do it in a smooth way. It's kind of like driving an automobile. If you're going to change lanes, you ought to do it slowly. If you try to do it within an instant, you're going to roll the car over. So we need public policy programs that will take us in the right direction in a nice, smooth way. And it doesn't have implications for our forecasts at all. So then the forecast that we feel most comfortable giving is, and most confident about, and the forecast that none of you in this audience believe, is a year from now you're going to be a year older. And the reason I know you don't believe it is you're not putting away enough money to take care of retirement. So this is me, not quite today, but maybe a little bit before. And this is me, maybe not quite tomorrow, or perhaps the day after here on the right. So that's inevitable. We need to worry about that. So the messages that I'm about to talk about are we need much higher national savings because we have lower income growth. We don't have that 3% anymore, that normal GDP growth. It looks like it's going to be 2.5% or 2%. That means you need higher savings, not lower. I'll tell you why in a minute. We have lower real rates of return on investment. So we used to be able to count on 6%. Now maybe the real return is only 2%. A lot of savers say, what's the point of saving if you're only making that tiny amount? If you're saving for retirement, the opposite is the case. If you're a pension manager managing a fund to take care of retirement obligations going forward, and that rate of return is lower, you have to get more contributions, not less, because you don't have the power of compounding. And then thirdly, we've had a big increase in spending opportunities late in life, post-retirement. If you're planning on spending a lot in post-retirement, you have to save a whole lot more while you're working. So let's talk about each one of these three. This is an image that compares the savings profile as a function of age. Over here on the left, this is 1960. And the horizontal axis represents how old people were, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. Peak spending occurred at about 55 years old. And then as you're going into retirement age, the spending becomes less. But over on the right, that's where we are now, with a huge spike up in spending late in life. Huge. That's Medicare. It's partly the way we fund healthcare, but it's also a huge technological change in which there's a very expensive medical opportunities very late in life. And although that may not be on your balance sheet, you're hoping Medicare is going to take care of it, as a nation, it's on our balance sheet. So we need, as a nation, to save more in order to fund that very high level late in life spending. So we're now going to look at these three different scenarios and to think about what's the right savings rate, just like financial planning. So we're going to look at three possible income paths. One is that you're 40 years old, your income is going to grow at 3% per year until age 65, and then you're going to fund retirement spending from age 65 out of 85 out of the savings that you do. We'll look at a 2% income growth and a 0% income growth. And then on the right-hand side, these are three different spending plans. The first one you see is the old spending plan in which you spent less in retirement than you did before. We'll look at a level plan, and then we'll look at the plan that's in place today with more spending late in life compared to spending during the working years. So this first graph shows you, as a function of the real rate of return, that blue image, if you assume a 0% rate of growth, how much savings do you have to do if you have the old style of retirement, 75% retirement? And you can see out at the right, if you have an 8% rate of return, it's almost 10%. If it's 2% return, it's a whole lot more. So that's the force that you need to put away more savings. If you want to spend at 100% or even more, if it's like today, you want to spend at 125%, that requires much higher savings. Those savings rates are enormous. That's like 40%. Who do you know, what 40-year-old puts away 40%? And as a nation, we're not putting anything away. Our collective savings is zero. So these forces are dictating much higher savings. Things can get help out if you have higher income growth. So that's the savings if you have 0. If you have 2%, if you have 3%, you do better. You don't need to save as much. So if we're working this 2% rate of return, the appropriate savings rate if you have a 3% economy is about 17 or 18%. If we're moving into a 2% economy, it's more like 25%, more like we are today. So the message is not here in the details. There are two messages. It's astounding how big these numbers are. I'm not saying they apply to you necessarily, but you should be astounded by how big the savings rates are needed under this scenario, because I think the same thing is true whatever scenario applies to you. And secondly, there are these three forces that dictate much higher savings rates. And so our nation is moving in entirely the wrong direction. And raising the retirement age can help a lot. If you move from 65 to 66 to 67 to 68. Actually, when you're 68, if you have a retirement age of 68, you can't quite see it, but you can have negative savings if you move from 65 to 68. If you extend that retirement age, when you're 40 years old, you don't have to put away anything. You can borrow against future income and have a more spending at that age. So the retirement age is a critical solution, an obvious solution for Social Security, not an obvious one for Medicare, because we got to decide what we're going to do with it late in life spending. Extremely difficult issues. So then here's the reality of the nation. This is a slide that illustrates the population fractions of the United States. So the young kids are down at the bottom, the elderly are up at the top. The big blue, that's at the beginning, is the 0 to 4-year-olds. Up at the top, and the vertical bar represents where we are today. Up at the top, that's the 80-year-olds and above. And the 75 to 80, you can see there's a big bulge in the fraction of Americans up there at that expensive age, 80 and above. That's the baby boomers are growing older, and that's exactly where the spending is going to be. And we need to prepare for that incredible burst of spending going forward. So my view is what we need is an AAYP. This is a huge intergenerational transfer. That deficit that the federal government is incurring is going to be paid for by the next generation of taxpayers. So I think rather than environmental impact statements, we need youth impact statements. And the reason is that we're engaged in a kind of fiscal child abuse in this country. With federal debt, state and local retirement obligations, weak education, incredible college debt burdens that we're putting on these kids, and a deteriorating infrastructure. LA is not fixing its potholes anymore. So we're passing a much deteriorated America on to the next generation. So then what are we going to do about this? What programs need to be cut in order to rein in the government spending? You can do some on the tax side. You can't do it all on the tax side. It's not going to happen. So we're going to have to pull back some of these programs. This is a chart that represents the spending as a share of revenue. So that blue bar in the middle, that's you spent all your revenue if we hit that bar. So here's veterans benefits. So after World War I and back in the 30s, you have a big spike up in benefits that consumed a lot of the revenue. More than 50% of revenue was consumed in veterans benefits. It's not a big thing now. So don't complain about veterans benefits, not a big issue. This is unemployment that there's a lot of complaint about. You can see that little bump up at the far right because of the recession, but we're far, far from exhausting the revenues of the federal government. So you add tax credits, other retirement, railroad retirement, military medical insurance, workers' comp, pension benefits, veterans life insurance, black lung, direct relief, food stamps. That's the first big one. That's Social Security. That takes a big chunk out of the federal apple. Next comes Medicare. And then the next one is Medicaid. And then finally is the welfare for the corporations. That's subsidies to business. And that's almost 100% of revenue. Before we funded the Department of Defense or Department of Commerce, we exhausted 100% of revenue in these transfer programs in which the government takes money in and gives it to somebody else. So you add to this the spending by the non-defense parts of government, by the defense, by the various kinds of investment. And last, that thin sliver at the top, red, that's interest payments. That's really a bigger chunk because we have incredibly low interest rates given us by the Federal Reserve that have, in a sense, accommodated this bad behavior by not making Americans realize how much we're really going to have to spend later on because the interest rates currently are so low. So you do the calculus, it's got to be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and Defense. There's got to be some combination of those that's got to be reined in to bring that budget into balance. And then in terms of Washington, D.C., this is an email that I got. This is the so-called Fiscal Cliff. So lesson one is U.S. tax revenue is $2.17 trillion. Federal budget is 3.8. We can't understand those numbers. So the proposal is, let's divide them, let's eliminate 8 zeros and think of this as a household. So this is a household that has an annual income of $21,700. It's spending $38,200. So it's adding to the credit card $16,000 $1,500. Its outstanding balance on a credit card is $142,710. Its budget cuts so far, that's a reference to the Fiscal Cliff, $38.50. So we're not making any progress on this critical issue. So here's another way to look at it. Let's say you come home from work and find there has been a sewer backup in your neighborhood and your home has sewage all the way to the ceiling. What should you do? Raise the ceiling or clean out the shit? Sorry for that aggressive language, but I hope I'm communicating a point here. So here's the final message that we had yesterday, that it's fundamental that America is in a debate about who's going to pay for their schooling and who's going to pay for their Viagra, which is covered by Medicare. So on that note, I'm happy to turn this thing over to my colleague, Jerry Nickelsburg, who's not quite yet eligible for Medicare.
Thank you, Ed. But I'm actually quite disappointed to learn that next December I'm going to be a year older. So Ed has set the stage here for looking at California. And California is really a microcosm of the U.S. And in 2009, as we were ending this last deep recession, I described California as being a bifurcated economy, two economies. And those two economies really represent this new economy, these microprocessors, where the world is going and where the world has been. And so I'm going to show you a video of the same conference that that video that Ed showed you came from. In which I describe that in California and go through the forecast, looking at the regions in California. So I think that if you think about this in the context of how the world has changed, it'll give you some perspective of what's happening in California, and I think you'll also find the rap singer reference in this. So let's see. Thank you, David. Good morning. So now we turn to California, and since the beginning of the economic recovery in the latter half of 2009, we've been talking about this bifurcated California recovery, the two Californias, the inland California, which has historically been dependent on growth in residential construction, in traditional manufacturing, and in government, and has been really the recipient of a lot of in-migration. And those are all things that in the early part of the recovery simply weren't happening. And the inland part of California continued to contract even as the U.S. Turned the corner and started an expansion. And the coastal California, an economy which is knowledge-based, technology-based, heavily involved in international trade, which has been growing and growing rapidly and growing faster than the U.S. So these two different trajectories. So now we're in the beginning of the fifth year of this recovery, and I want to return to that and revisit it and ask the question, are we getting some convergence? Are things kind of changing? Do we still have two Californias? And what does that mean for the forecast? And so a spoiler alert, the answer is no, they're not converging. Which brings me to the two things that I have underneath that, linking it to our topic today. On the left is a line from Ice Cube's 2010 Man vs. Machine song, and I would actually rap this for you, but I'm really afraid of all the emails that will come in. So I'll just read it, which is, the whole world is automated. It needs to be investigated, which is what Ed is going to talk about in his, when people are eliminated. And then on the right is, of course, Bender Bending Rodriguez, the evil robot from the TV series Futurama. Those relate to what I'm going to talk about because one of the reasons, and maybe the principal reason why we're not getting this bifurcated California, these two Californias to converge into one economy, relates to automation in the workplace, in the changing workplace and the changing demands. So to do this, we'll talk about the movement of goods in California and what that means and what we can draw from that in terms of both the forecast and the changing demands, sectoral demands within the state, and then look at employment and kind of in detail, both by sector and by geography, and conclude with what does that mean for the forecast and what is our forecast for California. So the first chart that you see here is air cargo, international air cargo. So this is through SFO and LAX, our two international airports. And so in advertisement, if you read my latest paper on high-speed rail, you'll see that I talk about this being inadequate for the 21st century. But this is what we have now. We are not at capacity. And the thing that ought to strike you is that we've been in a recovery now since 2009. But look at the trend there. It's completely flat. This is tonnage of goods coming into the California's international airports on the top, and going out is the line on the bottom. Both flat, no trend at all. If we turn to the two airports in California, they're the principal hubs for package delivery. So this is going to be domestic air transport of goods. We find the same thing. In Oakland on the top, completely flat. And Ontario on the bottom, same thing. So we've had growth, but we don't get any goods movement, at least in these major airports. The smaller airports, and these are considerably smaller than the traffic that you saw in the first two slides, we get a little bit in San Jose Mineta or Lindbergh Field down in San Diego or Bob Hope. You get a little bit of increase in air cargo. So at best, we can say by air, we've got a very lackluster growth in goods movement here in California. Well, what about our seaports? Our seaports in California, the largest seaport in the Western Hemisphere is the Los Angeles Long Beach complex, and the top line, which, well, both of these include Oakland as well. Top line is imports, again, totally flat, and that affects logistics. Now, this is volume, not tonnage, but no trend there. And then the bottom line is exports, again, no trend. So in terms of goods movement, we're seeing very little increase in goods movement in this recovery, and no indication that that is going to change. One of the explanations might be, well, we're buying higher valued things, and they're smaller. They're iPads instead of Macs. But this is really too consistent across all of these different modes of transportation. And indeed, if you look outside California, for example, the ports of Tacoma and Seattle, you get the same picture, for that to be the entire story. Rather, a piece of this story has got to be a shift in demand from goods towards other kinds of services, and we'll see that in the employment numbers. But just the overall employment, so this is total employment. It comes from what we call the household survey, and these are individuals who are asked if they're employed. So they've represented that they have a job. In the recession, we lost 1,060,000 jobs here in California, and we've recovered virtually all of that. And if you look at the kind of that block all the way over on the right, which is the difference between what we've recovered and what we lost, we think that's just a statistical anomaly, and that's going to be revised up. So basically, in terms of total employment, we have a recovery of all the jobs that are lost, but that's changed a bit because a lot of these are people who are self-employed, who are creating their own jobs and starting new businesses. But how do we compare nationally? Well, this is the last 12 months, but this has been consistent since the beginning of the recovery. This is the rate of job formation or employment in employment change by state. And you see on the left, the highest one is the small state of Utah. And then comes California, of course, colored in blue and gold, and then the rest of the states. So we're number 2 in job formation, and we have been for some time. But even though we're number 2 in job formation, it's really been uneven. So what you see here are different parts of California, and over on the left is the Bay Area. So we've got Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and they're growing at twice the U.S. rate. Los Angeles is also over on the left, but Los Angeles, unlike Silicon Valley and San Francisco, an awful lot of that is self-employed rather than payroll jobs. We're going to turn to payroll jobs in a moment and look at this in a little different way. But as you move your eyes from left to right, you are moving from coastal California to inland California. And when you get over to the right, you get rates of job growth in the Inland Empire, in the San Joaquin Valley, that are comparable to the U.S. rates. So very anemic rates. And the point here is that if you have the coast growing much faster than the inland, you're not getting convergence. They're diverging. You've got a coastal economy that is still growing, that is still vibrant, and an inland economy that is really struggling like much of the U.S. And part of the reason, and maybe the big part of the reason, has to do with what kinds of jobs are being created. So, for example, in the Inland Empire, in construction and manufacturing, we're still seeing a decline in jobs. So they're still contracting in construction and manufacturing, huge part of the Inland Empire's economy. And so to look at it a different way, now, so this is payroll employment. This is what firms report they have on their books as individuals who are working for them. And, we first start with the Inland Empire. And you get some improvement, and then it flattens out. And then we get Fresno, and then San Joaquin, and Sacramento. And these are the inland ones. They all look pretty much the same. The East Bay also looks very much the same, and that's because the East Bay has a lot of the characteristics of other parts of inland California. But then San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So this chart compares 2006, the peak in 2006 to today. They've fully recovered. They're more than 100% and still growing. Los Angeles is there. It's kind of top of the pack, but the pack isn't really moving very much. This is Orange County, and Orange County is kind of interesting because Orange County, with the collapse of the subprime mortgage industry, took a real big hit, as much as the Inland Empire, but they've recovered about half of those jobs, whereas the Inland Empire really hasn't. And then finally San Diego, which has not fully recovered, but is making good progress. So you see that when you look at this from the perspective of payroll employment, you get the same kind of picture. And these jobs are being created in the service sector. So this is on the left, far left is leisure and hospitality, and then you start moving over towards the right, and you get healthcare, education, professional, scientific, and technical services, and all the way over on the right are jobs that Ed's going to talk about that he calls foundational jobs in manufacturing. So we've got a real disparity on what jobs are being created, and we can look at this in terms of the composition. So this is a comparison of payroll employment by sector relative to 2006, and these are the sectors that have now fully recovered and are growing. These are our growth sectors. So there's mining and logging, and that recovery is really Kern County's oil boom. But then we get professional, scientific, and technical services. We get private education, healthcare, and then finally leisure and hospitality. So if you think about those sectors, with the exception of leisure and hospitality, these are sectors that require some very specific skills and different skills than we've had before. Looking at those sectors that have just recovered and are really pretty flat and not contributing much in the way of job growth, we've got wholesale, transportation, warehousing, other services, and federal government. That spike in federal government is the census. And those that are not growing, well, you have on the bottom construction. And keep in mind that construction on the coast was about 3 to 4 to 4.5% of the labor force. Inland, it was 6 to 8% of the labor force. And in construction, we've got some recovery as we have now new home building here in California, but nowhere near what we had before, and we don't expect that to get back to what we had in the days before the Great Recession. And then next, what you get is these foundational jobs, durable goods manufacturing, non-durable goods manufacturing. You see it drops, and it just really doesn't come back. Finance is in there, a little bit of coming back, but finance is affected, similar to all of the rest of these, in that finance and retail are, and these other sectors are sectors that are being automated. And we can bring back Bending Rodriguez here. And you really are seeing this, and you're seeing it, for example, in the grocery store, where there's just recently a story about Ralph's. In order to be competitive and lower costs, they are replacing checkers with more automated checkouts. And the governor is about to sign an increase in the minimum wage. And when I read about that, I thought about the 60 Minutes segment last Sunday on automation in the workplace, where they showed a hospital where robots are delivering to wards food, medication, and taking laundry to and from the wards. And as you increase the cost of labor in these jobs, the drive for productivity and for competitiveness is going to have that come into restaurants and hotels. So these are sectors that really are in trouble, and that we don't see any reason why that's going to change in the near future, certainly in our forecast horizon. So what that means for our forecast is that in spite of the fact that we have relatively fast growth here in California and better than the U.S., there's a limit to how fast that can accelerate. We've got this drag because we still have labor markets that are very much troubled and that are the subject of our conference today. And these two Californias really are not converging. We have not seen yet, save Kern County, any new engine of growth that's going to generate jobs in the inland parts of the state to the extent that they can really get a solid recovery this decade. And that brings us to our forecast, still growing faster than the U.S., with employment growth in the 2% range by the end of the forecast. And that means that unemployment is coming down, and we are getting a convergence of California's unemployment rate with the U.S. rate, with an average of 6.9% for the year 2015. And housing, although it has not taken off quite as fast as we predicted, is still very much going to be a growth industry as we have job formation and household formation. So that concludes the California forecast, and now I want to turn it over. So now what I want to do is update you on the forecast. What you saw there was a California that was growing, but some ominous signs. The ominous signs mainly being the fact that we're getting no growth in goods movement in California. And 3 months of economic activity have passed since that forecast was made. I want to update you on that, and then we can move into your questions for Ed and myself. So to begin with, I want to go to the labor force, and this is something that Ed was talking about in his presentation. The labor force is comprised of two components. One is all of the people who are working, they're in the labor force. And secondly, those who are out looking for a job, they're actively looking for a job. You add those two together, you get the labor force, and people come in and go out of the labor force. It provides an indicator, just one indicator, but an indicator of the health of labor markets, because if workers are discouraged, they leave the labor market. They reduce the size of the labor force, but they're discouraged. They would be there if labor markets were healthier, if they thought their job prospects were better. So if you're seeing discouraged workers, that's a bad sign. And if you're seeing the labor force grow, that may be in part because of population, but it may also be because labor markets are improving and people are seeing opportunities. They're then coming into the labor force. This is California's labor force, and you can see here, that's the Great Recession, a big dip, but then it starts growing and has kind of consistently grown since we began the recovery here in California. Now, this pattern that you see is atypical. It's true of California, it's true of Texas, in a more limited sense, it's true of Florida, but most states in the US don't show this pattern. And as Ed was indicating in his talk, labor markets in the US are very troubled. And we see throughout the US discouraged workers, still discouraged workers, and a labor force that's lower than what we had prior to the Great Recession. But not in California, because you saw earlier that we in California have had an increase in jobs. What is kind of worrisome here is the last 5 months. Our labor force has been just flat, not increasing. So a couple of days ago, Ed asked me, well, isn't this perhaps because people are leaving California? We have Prop 30, we have higher taxes, lots of complaints about that. Why not go to sunny Texas or places where there are ice storms today? But the answer is that's not people leaving California, because this pattern of labor force growth flattening out is seen throughout the US. It's seen in Texas, in Florida, in Utah, and in many other states it's actually turned negative again. So this is kind of an ominous sign. That's California's labor force. I want to go to the next one here. This is California's unemployment rate. So the way in which the unemployment rate is calculated is you measure via a survey how many people are looking for jobs. They're in the labor force, you divide it by the labor force. So it's a percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. And the unemployment rate has been coming down steadily in California, but for the last 5 months, it also has been flat. So what do we have here? We have a labor force over the last 5 months that's not been growing, and unemployment that's not been growing. That means the level of employment hasn't been growing. We've simply been flat for a fairly long period of time. And that's kind of worrisome. That means that we're not getting sort of this solid growth and really eating into the unemployment that we have. But an encouraging sign, now I got to go back because these are out of order. An encouraging sign is this. This is payroll employment. So payroll employment counts the number of jobs, not whether people are employed. So individuals can have more than one job. I can work here at UCLA and then in the evenings go to Nobu in Malibu and be a security guard. That's 2 jobs. It's counted twice here, but I'm only employed once. So in the employment numbers that we saw previously, I'm counted once, I'm counted twice here. What we've seen is a very steady recovery in the number of jobs. And these are payroll jobs. They are not independent contractors. They're not the self-employed. And you don't see any flattening out. So what's happening there? There are a couple of things that might be happening. One is people are getting 2 jobs. They're doubling up. And that's the increase in the number of jobs, but not employment. But there's anecdotal evidence that what is happening here is that early in the economic recovery, firms were not hiring. They were bringing people on as consultants, as 1099 contract workers, so not employed in a payroll job, but still employed. And that this increase in jobs more recently is that firms are getting more confident in the demand for their products, and therefore they're converting these 1099 contract workers to regular employees. So that's a good sign. So we've got some good signs and some worrisome signs as we look at the California economy. But again, the growth in the California economy over the last 3 months, as you just saw for previous to the last 3 months, is very much disparate. It's geographically separated. The dashed line here is the growth rate of the number of jobs, so that's payroll employment, growth rate of the number of jobs in the US over the last 12 months. It's about 1.7%. And looking at California by regions, we find, not surprisingly, the coastal regions are outperforming the US. They have been consistently since July of 2009 when the Great Recession ended. Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Orange County, San Diego, and Ventura County growing faster than the US, not quite as much as they were before, because there have been times when, for example, Silicon Valley has grown at 3 times the US rate, but still substantially above the US rate. Then we have the also ran parts of the state, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, and Sacramento Delta. Interesting aspect about Los Angeles is, just as there are 2 Californias, there are 2 Los Angeleses. So where we are now in West LA, if you were to separate that out from the rest of LA, it looks very much like Silicon Valley in terms of employment growth rates and income growth rates. And that means that the rest of Los Angeles is really doing very poorly, because on average, for the county as a whole, since 1990, we have no real increase in the number of jobs in the county of Los Angeles. So that's a kind of startling fact. And then when you separate out West Los Angeles from the rest of Los Angeles, you realize that in the other part of the city, we have a decrease in jobs, and a fairly significant decrease in jobs. And that's an important issue for us going forward. And then we have finally the East Bay and the San Joaquin Valley. And notice the San Joaquin Valley, in spite of the boom in employment initially with the Monterey Shale, is now losing jobs once again. So they're still in the trough, looking up, no real recovery. And what's happened in Kern County recently is really sort of telling for those who are saying, well, if we just exploit the Monterey Shale, we're going to have 2.5 million new jobs in California. Doesn't really look like it from the evidence so far. Another way to look at this is to compare California cities to the rest of the country. So in 2011, I put together this chart, and let me explain the chart. The red bars are cities in California. The darker color, the gray, are cities outside of California. This is a measure of the unemployment rate. And as you can see, the red is sort of all the way over to the right. Higher unemployment rates in California than in the rest of the country. Moreover, the bars that are the highest on the far right are the inland parts of the state. As you move kind of over to the left, you see a couple of these that seem to have sort of escaped and broken out. That is Orange County and San Francisco. But for the most part, we're pretty much over there, the worst in the US. Since July 2011, so in the last 2 years, we've had employment growth everywhere. Unemployment rates have come down. And so this picture has changed, and it's changed to look like this. And so you see all the unemployment rates have come down, but the first thing to notice here is that in the cities in California, at least the ones towards the left, the red bars towards the left, the unemployment rates are lower than many of those that are further to the left. So those have moved towards the left, but the ones on the right, those are the inland cities, still the worst in the US. So we're getting this further separation, this wider gap between the 2 Californias. And furthermore, another way that you can lower the unemployment rate is if you have a decrease in the labor force, right? If you have discouraged workers who leave the labor force, that will lower the unemployment rate. And that has happened not in the coastal cities of California, in the inland cities, the ones on the right, and in the ones that I've turned green here. So from that perspective, the California cities on the coast have moved even further away from those inland and from many cities in the rest of the US. And it's that difference in the 2 economies that is really quite important in understanding California, because the coastal economies are driven by technology, by knowledge communities, by this 21st century economy, not competing with the microprocessors and robots, but programming them, designing them, manufacturing them, and using them in manufacturing. and the inland parts of the state still very much dependent on government and construction and traditional manufacturing. And so finally, before we turn to looking to your questions, I want to look at this notion that Ed just talked about of us undersaving. The big undersaving question in California, aside from the national question, which Ed described, is our problem with pensions. So we have votes in San Diego and in San Jose to modify pensions. We have cities in bankruptcy, Stockton that seems to be coming through their bankruptcy without altering their pension plan, San Bernardino in bankruptcy, apparently pretty soon, possibly soon, Desert Hot Springs, Vallejo went through bankruptcy, never addressed the pension problem, looks like they're going back in. This is also a question of undersavings. The pension plans represent promises for expenditures in the future. And they, in many cases, come without the resources to actually make those expenditures. So what you see in this graph is a comparison of the unemployment rate to unfunded liabilities by pension plans for government employees for counties. So this is the county government. It's not an aggregation of the county, but it's only county government pension plans for the 15 largest counties in California. And I did this scatter diagram with the unemployment rate, with growth in property taxes, growth in sales taxes, sort of you name it, indicator of the local economy's status. They all look like this. There's sort of no pattern between what's happening in the local economy in terms of its health and the funding of pensions. And in fact, if you look at the top 6, these 3 are Santa Clara County, Orange County, and San Mateo County, certainly counties that we think of as doing very well. They're coastal counties, outperforming the US, really creating jobs, creating wealth, but they have huge unfunded liabilities for their pension plans. And then on the right, Kern, Riverside, and San Joaquin. The point here is that you can't just say we have a problem with unfunded pensions, we have a savings gap because we had a big economic recession. And if you look at other governmental agencies, entities, you get the same kind of result. Adelanto in the high desert, very hard hit in the recession, and not an affluent community, very well-funded pensions. Imperial County, highest unemployment rate in the US, and been there for a long time, very well-funded pension plan. West Hollywood, very much unfunded. These savings gaps are a function of political decisions that have been made by these governmental agencies and not a function of whether or not they have significant economic growth. And so the answer to the pension problems are going to be political as well. So finally, the impact of all of this on the forecast relative to the one that you just saw in the video is that overall California labor markets are improving, but very much at a tepid rate, and inland California continues to fall behind. There's some bright spots, but they are few and far between, particularly in the inland parts of the state. So the forecast that you saw a moment ago is pushed down a little bit. We're growing, 1.7% growth in employment in 2013, the year we're finishing up. It'll move up just a tick to 1.8% in 2014, and then we go to 2.2% as we get out to 2015. So the picture is improving, but at a slow rate. And the reason why it's at a slow rate is that we really do have these 2 Californias, and we have this issue of how do you move people who are in the 20th century economy where you're not getting an increase in the demand for their skills into the 21st century economy. That's the workforce development problem that Ed explicated so well. And then I have to leave you with a cute picture of elephants plodding along. And that's really kind of an image of the California economy. We're improving, we're getting better, we're getting there. But sort of every step is this slow, lumbering step forward. And that concludes my review of where we've gone since the last forecast. And now I think we turn to questions, right?
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sure on behalf of the audience and certainly on behalf of the panel and the university, we really, really appreciate getting the update and also the background. So bravo for that. But the news was horrible. All right. So it seemed, given your presentation of information, that we have at least this notion of two Californias, an inland California, a coastal California. What occurred to me as you were speaking particularly was that LA is largely leading on self-employment, that the payroll jobs not so interesting, but the self-employment really interesting. And then you say, well, the inland jobs responsible or somehow tied largely to construction and manufacturing, both of those with a very poor prognosis. A simple question is, how does the inland part of California recover? Do we have to drag them into the 21st century? And kind of for me, a more subtle or larger question even perhaps is, why doesn't the opportunity, the notion, the schema for self-employment, why hasn't that infected the inland portion of California? So there's two questions in there. Do we have to drag them? And is self-employment going to be their way, the way it's been, if you will, our way?
Yeah, so let me take the second question first, which is about self-employment. So for a very long time, California has been one of the most entrepreneurial states in the US by any measure, and there are these metrics on it. Los Angeles being the leading city, in San Francisco and the Bay Area number 2. And I think San Diego is number 4. So California is very much an entrepreneurial state. A lot of that has to do with the fact that in California we have these great knowledge communities, and they spur innovation. And kind of the ethos is that if you innovate, you can create something here in California, create a business and grow that business. And that entrepreneurial spirit is certainly part of the California ethos. And that should be the case inland as well as the coast, but along the coast is where you have these critical masses of knowledge communities. And so that's an important component of it. The second part of your question is, do we have to drag the inland parts of the state along? And I kind of don't like that imagery of dragging the inland parts of the state along. Inland California is different from coastal California. I think one thing that our policymakers need to do is really recognize that one size doesn't fit all in a state as big and diverse as California. There are many aspects of the inland parts of the state, and of course they're all different. The southern San Joaquin Valley, from the Sac Delta, from Riverside County and San Bernardino. But we need policies that address their comparative advantages. And there's sort of many ways in which the inland parts of the state can create engines of growth, but right now we see no new engines of growth, and that's kind of the discouraging thing.
Can I jump in on this too?
Please.
So the county of Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles has 2 million people in poverty, and these poverty pockets are geographically concentrated and very permanent. So we've got a human resource in LA that is being left behind. If we could tap into that, we would have much better outcomes. And I venture to guess if you looked at entrepreneurial activities, those same communities that have weak high schools and weak educational systems are the least likely to produce entrepreneurs. The same thing is true in the eastern counties as well. We've got that huge Hispanic population that is relatively, with lower educational attainments, and I think you'd find it lower entrepreneurial attitudes, although many of them are very entrepreneurial. We Californians have a huge stake in the success of these inland counties that are largely Hispanic, because they're the ones who are going to be paying our taxes in the future. So a program that brings them on board, I think, would be great. But Jerry didn't offer anything specific. If you elect me governor, what I will do is I'll divide the state north and south with a line, and we'll let the western counties proceed as they are, but the eastern counties will back off on environmental and workforce regulations so we can bring some manufacturing to those counties. Because I think without something like that, you're going to have to depopulate those areas.
So as the other candidate for governor, I don't think the notion of bringing manufacturing back is going to really solve the problem. And to illustrate that, in the last Super Bowl, Subaru had this advertisement that they're really an American company, even though the name doesn't sound like they're an American company. And so they had a Caucasian fellow there with a hard hat on, an American lapel pin, explaining how they were doubling the size of their factory in Tennessee. And Tennessee is this low-wage state and so on, right-to-work state. And they had they videoed him in front of the assembly line. And the assembly line had no people. It was just robots in Tennessee. So we can build factories in the inland parts of the state. They are going to have robots because that's the way that you get the efficiency. But for a specific suggestion, one thing that we can sell that is in demand and will be in increasing demand throughout the world is education. We have 8 universities, major universities in inland California, and they are primarily purposed to educate Californians. But why not double their sizes and sell education to people in other parts of the US and other parts of the world? Those are exports from California, brings money in, brings good jobs in, and you then get a multiplier effect by bringing in these jobs and bringing in this money and growing the local economy. So that's the kind of thing that we could do as a matter of policy in creating 21st century kinds of jobs.
Okay, Jerry, I offered you that I would allow you to be my lieutenant governor, but I've changed my mind.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we'll move on.
Gentlemen, I too very much enjoyed and appreciated the lectures. I have a question from Andrew in Pasadena. The question is, what will be the effect of the Federal Reserve cutting back on their monetary or money creation and bond purchases?
Yeah, so the take on that is it's a national issue. And we don't think that all that bond buying has had an impact on the economy. It affects the Wall Street. We've seen a big elevation in equity values, which is basically a transfer of income, by the way, away from the savers who are relying on interest earnings in favor of the wealthier people, really, who have equity investments. And that transfer hasn't had any impact on Wall Street. It's kind of hard to tell that the Federal Reserve is doing anything other than laying a foundation for some very serious recession, because they built a huge increase in the reserves in the commercial banking system. If the commercial banking system becomes normal again, you're going to see a big expansion of money, then you say deposits, and the incipient inflation is going to become real. So we don't think that there's any like a recession on the horizon that would be caused by the Federal Reserve changing its policy with regard to purchasing of the assets and even buying some of them back. It's not going to have a dramatic impact. You're going to see higher interest rates. You need to have some insurance against that in your policies, in your portfolio management. I like Warren Buffett when he says bonds should come with warning labels, because when those interest rates go up, there's going to be very substantial losses on those bonds. But other than that, I don't see a big issue with regard to Federal Reserve. I kind of think of they're working in some parallel universe where they imagine that they matter, but they really haven't. They've demonstrated that all those policies don't have a big impact.
Yeah, so I agree completely with Ed on this. I think every month that the Federal Reserve buys $80 billion of bonds is a month where the risk to the U.S. economy of having too much money in the system increases. And the issue is really not, is it dangerous to taper and then take this liquidity out, but is it dangerous to wait longer?
Thank you.
I found what you said really interesting because it kind of paralleled my career. So I started out as an engineer in manufacturing, and now I am an educator and a service provider of social media. So I think everybody should take our classes. This question is from Dale in Rockland, California, and he wants to know how much are the problems with Obamacare likely to inhibit the growth in the private sector and new jobs?
Sure. So the short answer is no one knows. The longer answer is that that there are really two sides to this. There are the well-known problems with the structure of Obamacare, including penalties for jumping from 49 to 50 employees. The other side of that is that if you have a healthier workforce, you're going to have a more productive workforce. And moreover, it will no longer be the case that if you have someone in your family who has some sort of medical condition, that you're kind of tied to your job. You can't go out and start a company. You can't move to a new job because then you have someone with a pre-existing condition and you lose your insurance. So this creates more labor mobility. You get more efficiency. That creates more growth. How those things net out, I think no one really knows. What we do know is that right now the implementation is very disruptive. And so that has a negative impact. But the long run impact, I think, remains to be seen.
So I think there's, to continue that thought, there's a real timing problem. The worst time to do a healthcare overhaul like we've had is when the labor market is weak. We need to do everything we can to get Americans back to work. And after that's done, we'll deal with this healthcare issue. And instead, we put this on the backs of the firms that are doing hiring. And it's not surprising that hiring would be a little more tepid. Now, nobody knows for sure, but it seems inevitable that the timing of the decision to do this healthcare overhaul was not a wise timing. If you had elected me president,
Yes.
I would have focused on Wall Street. That would have been my first target. I would have done healthcare later. And if I had done healthcare, I would have said, first of all, we're going to take care of every child in America. Every kid in America ought to have access to decent health care. So Medicare is nice for the elderly, but we've got a bunch of kids, lots of kids in Los Angeles who when they go to school, they can't see because nobody thought to put glasses on them. They have never seen a dentist. They have all kinds of medical problems. We ought to be taking care of these kids with universal health care for them. And I really worry about the complexity of the healthcare delivery system, whether any government agency, particularly federal government, could think this through carefully enough to let this thing really work. So I would kind of lean toward thinking this is going to unravel in one way or another, in an unexpected way, just because the federal government can't really do it effectively.
Thank you.
Just on behalf of the Affordable Care Act, my health insurance was cut in half in terms of the cost, so I'm glad you're not president. Exactly. And by
But
the
what's
way,
your deductible?
and being a woman is no longer a pre-existing condition. Thank you, Catherine Sibilis. All right. So speaking of people who would be king, Governor Brown has claimed that the passage of Prop 30 and a simple majority in the legislature should make it, or is making it, easier to pass budgets, and therefore our perennial crisis and severe cutting of state programs is over. Is that true? Is it good? And what are the risks to California given those circumstances?
Well, I'll do this one first.
Okay.
Governor Brown is the first governor that we've had who's faced a decade-long decline in jobs. So when the first Governor Brown was with us, California was adding jobs at about the rate of 40% per decade. In that kind of environment, there's no mistake that you make because what you give away is quickly corrected by the incredible revenue that you get. So we think California is going to have much slower economic growth. It's not going to go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s in which we had that incredible job growth. And that means the decisions in Sacramento are still very critical. You can still make mistakes that are not going to be erased by revenue growth. But in terms of the politics in Sacramento, I think that's greatly improved. I think the governor's done a great job moving us in the right direction. We need to have intelligent adults running our governments, both in Sacramento and in Washington. And I think we're stepping in the right direction with regard to one of those.
So I agree with that, and think that the governor in that statement was 50% right. So the majority vote on budgets was something that we needed. We needed to get beyond a minority creating gridlock. And hopefully California has just sort of shown the nation the way to go on that. In addition, getting rid of partisan redistricting and going to the top 2 vote, those are reforms that really help here in California. Prop 30, what it does is it buys some time, but it doesn't solve any problems in and of itself. So the statement by the governor that we are now out of the land of recurrent fiscal crises, which the Legislative Analyst's Office, the LAO, has repeated, is simply fallacious, because what Prop 30 does is it increases the marginal tax rate on the top income earners in California. And the reason why we have such huge fluctuations in state revenue is because we fund government on those top income earners. Well, those are the entrepreneurs, those are the folks who are earning income from IPOs and bonuses and profits, and in a recession, those go away. So their income goes away, so the state revenue goes away, and now we're even more reliant on them. So Prop 30 doesn't solve anything except that it takes us out of crisis mode for a few years and gives the governor and the legislature a chance to fix the problem. John Perez, Speaker of the Assembly, had one proposal last year that went nowhere to try and fix the problem. And so it's anybody's guess as to whether or not we are really out of the woods with respect to our recurrent fiscal crises in Sacramento. Prop 30 gives us breathing room, but nothing more.
So to add to that, we had that conference yesterday. We talked about municipal balance sheets and municipal accounting, which is also true at the federal level. These entities do cash flow accounting. They don't put the unfunded liabilities for pension and health care onto their balance sheets. So that makes them look healthier than really are. So a big step in the right direction would be having accrual accounting in which the unfunded liabilities were booked on a year-by-year basis. That should be done at the level of the cities, but also the state, so we're not confused. Long ago, before we captured, before we found Saddam Hussein, my quip was if we ever captured him, we should put him in a room and make him read the California budget, because it's so confusing and opaque, it would drive the guy nuts.
As if 20 wives would not. Sir.
Ed, in particular, you point out the workforce development issues and the job subtracting impact of microprocessors. What kind of education should we be providing?
Well, I tried to communicate that. We need our students not to graduate with knowledge or ability to solve specific problems, but a basic attitude that the world is just beginning for them, that there's so much to learn and there's so many new problems that they can face. So that's what we need. We need more experiential education, less classroom lectures and testing. We had in that workforce development experience or program that we had this woman who's a lead teacher at the Fauché School, which is in downtown LA.
South Central LA.
South Central LA. And it's a poor neighborhood. So she's talking about how she teaches the kids to become computer programmers, because there's like 1 million jobs or more, a couple million jobs in computer programming coming forward. And she gets them programming games, and she gets them in teams working together. They're not the kids sitting in a classroom taking an exam. They're just totally energized to be able to have the opportunity to work together to kind of create these games. That's more experiential education that we should do.
So let me add to that. I think the answer to your question is, how should we structure education in California for the 21st century? Go visit the Fauché Learning Institute. So Leslie Aronson is the teacher, and her classroom has 40 kids. And we talk about we need to reduce class size. She has 40 kids in the class. It's in a poor school. The kids are from, majority of them, one-parent families that don't speak English. These kids are engaged, they're smart, they have computers of all different kinds. A lot of them are computers that have been sort of given away because they're old technology. All kinds of different computers around. They're working in teams. The classroom is not quiet, but it's orderly. And they're learning. And they're learning how to produce software, how to use these computers, how to operate in the 21st century. And it's really an exciting thing. But it's not money. It's the way in which we organize, the way in which she organizes education. It's this experiential that Ed is talking about. That's what we need to move to.
How would you say soft skills fit into the picture of that additional education?
Well, working in teams develops that soft skill. And one of the things that I noticed there was one group, it was 3 kids, and they were working on something, and they kind of sat back and they were scratching their heads, and then they looked over and somebody else came over from another group and started talking. So there's these kind of interpersonal skills, the teamwork skills that are all part of this new way of educating. But if you look in today's workforce, that's the way people are working. They're not standing at one station doing riveting as they were at the Douglas aircraft plant where I used to work, where you had one riveting station. That's what you did all day. People are working in teams, they're solving problems. And to solve problems, you need those soft skills, those interpersonal skills.
But I take the premise of that question to be that a computer can't express empathy to you. And I wouldn't underestimate a computer to create a sense that it's feeling empathy to you. And a couple of years ago, we had a report from these MIT economists, and they started listing the jobs that a computer could never do, that would never be automated. One of them high on the list was driving a truck or driving an automobile. Yet that's exactly what Google is doing now. So the ability of a computer to have soft skills it should not be underestimated.
Yeah, but remember, Hal was not very empathetic.
We can do better than Hal. We'll call him Jerry. How about that?
Okay.
Thank you.
With pretty much all our U.S. cities being bankrupt, what's going to happen to our retirees? Should they enroll in classes? And what about the young kids? What do you think their answer is? How can we support them financially without strong fiscal city governments?
So yesterday we had a conference that was completely related to this issue. And toward the end, I got up and said, I'd been at UCLA for 30 years. And it wasn't until the very end that I discovered how good UCLA is. In other words, I have a defined benefit plan. And all of my friends, including one of the other speakers, Larry Kotlikoff, are at these East Coast universities in which they lost half their retirement. And the reason that's an important point is it's very, very difficult for human beings to do retirement planning. It's very hard to look into the future and decide how much you should really save. And what I was amazed at is the UCLA did that for me. I didn't really have to worry about it. So as we foist more and more emphasis upon individuals to do their own retirement planning, we've got to step up. I think Extension could help out there because there's huge numbers of workers out there who need to start thinking about exactly where they're going to be when they retire and how much they need to save. And then these cities have a terrible problem, I think, because you can take their retirements away from these people who earned it, but that's not really a nice thing to do, and it's not really healthy economically. It's maybe what will happen, but I'm kind of doubtful that was the appropriate thing to do.
When we talk about saving, we can point to a lot of other countries around the world that have a culture or a history of savings. As a marketer, I fear savings. because that means that you're not going to sit in front of a Best Buy for 2 weeks so you can buy a 60-inch television for $200. But very seriously, we know that Japan basically saved themselves into stagnation. So, once again, I'm a marketer, sir.
I can hear that.
So, do we really want Americans to become savers to the level that it impacts purchasing so dramatically? And if we do, how exactly, from a social policy standpoint, a communication standpoint, or another standpoint, how do we accomplish that in a way that's productive?
Well, you don't believe my scatter diagram. I guess you were facing the wrong direction when I had it up there. But the scatter diagram illustrates for the United States there's no relationship between overall savings rates and growth. So we can still have a healthy, growing economy and a fully employed economy, just like those Asian countries that have sky-high savings rates. But I thought the Chinese were buying all your product now. Even though they have a high savings rate, they're not quite going to Walmart, but they're coming to the United States and going to Beverly Hills and buying all kinds of stuff today. So the economic growth creates wealth, and that wealth is a driving power for the consumer economy. You don't have to spend every dollar that you earn in order to have a healthy economy. I think we need education, and I also think we need leadership that identifies this as a critical issue for the nation, that we need higher savings. And then beyond just putting in words, we need a tax code that seriously advantages retirement planning. You ought to have incredible benefits if you put a little money away, tax benefits so you put a little money away.
Yeah, and I think that using the Asian experience in savings needs to be done very carefully. So China, for example, has a very high savings rate. Pre-Cultural Revolution in China, families would rely on the children. I mean, the children were really the savings. The children would take care of the parents when the parents became old. Post-Cultural Revolution, that's not the case. China has no safety net. And so if you are Chinese, what you need to do is save a lot, because otherwise you're going to be destitute. And so you get these high savings rates. That's created a huge problem for them, because this is also somewhat true for Japan, they have been an export growth-led economy, but that is dying off. So now they need to turn inwards, and they need to consume more and save less in order to keep their factories going. But the people in China do not want to save less because they're saving for a future that no one else is going to provide for.
Yeah, so the bottom line, Chinese need to become more like Americans, and Americans need to become more like Chinese. But we've got the red flag out here. I don't know who's going to end this, but speaking on behalf of the forecast, we're done now. I just want to thank you all who are in this audience physically, and as well as those who are with us over the internet. This has for us been a great experience, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to do more of these. I know there's lots of questions, huge numbers of questions that have been yet unanswered. So if you bring us back, we'll answer more of these questions.
Wow. This was more than I had anticipated or expected. This was really great. Thank you so much. I've learned a whole lot today. I hope you have too. A lot to think about in terms of how it shapes our work and how we move forward. There was one question that came in from an extension instructor that I would like to try to take a shot at answering. Now, remember, I'm not an economist, so keep that clear. But the question was, knowing the economic difficulties U.S. education is facing, and with particular regard to UCLA Extension, how do we ensure sufficient attendance while not sacrificing academic standards, particularly in the area of admissions? So I guess from my perspective, this is a really sort of complicated and complex problem, but let me start with one part of it, and sort of the broadest perspective, and that is the issue, and I think both of our presenters today spoke about that education is a solution. It is a solution now for everybody in the world. For a long time, the United States led the rest of the world in terms of its educational systems, particularly post-secondary education. We were number one in the world for a long, long period of time. And increasingly, we face an economy that requires knowledge workers. And so they talked about how we have to have more education, not less. It has to change in terms of its form, but we still have to push the education agenda. One of the sobering problems, however, is that we've gone from first to 15th in the percentage of our population now that has college degrees in terms of other countries of the world. So we are dropping while other countries are increasing, and they figured out the solution. So in the context of a global economy, that's a really big deal. From my perspective, then, the demand for education isn't going to go away. It is going to keep pushing us, and in fact, they even suggested maybe we wanted to go out and find people in other states and other nations. The challenges we face are ones of access and who's going to pay, and finally, how do we ensure success? One of the sobering facts of higher education in America over the last 30, 40 years is that only about 50% of those who start college ever finish. So we have large populations that do not, for whatever reason, and it rarely has to do with ability, they drop out of the higher education system. So the issue of how we build support systems and how we teach and have people learn in different ways is really critical from my perspective. The issue of experience-based education, I think would do a whole lot for motivation of students in terms of their engagement, and we even heard evidence of that, their engagement in the kind of learning. So we in higher education and education need to focus on motivational issues and the support structures we put forward in terms of to help students move forward in education and make the progress they need to make. On the issue of access and payment, is a different kind of an issue, and it seems to me that it's both an individual issue, but it is a societal one. And probably if anything has disturbed me more than anything else, it has been the states pulling away from supporting public higher education and foisting the burden completely on individuals, because as young people, we now heard, they can't hold up under the weight of all that debt they're taking on to get a college degree. So governments and others are going to have to come to grip with that issue of pay and access. I think we can help in higher education in some ways. Technology is a tool that can help us with access issues, and it can help in terms of efficiency issues. But they're not the only answers. We're going to have more. So I think we're part of the answer at UCLA and at UCLA Extension, and I look forward to us working in those areas. So let us bring this to an end, and let me start with some thank yous. Let's start with thank yous to Professors Lemur and Nickelsburg. Thank you very much. We very much appreciate this. Thank you to our Extension Instructor panel, and for all of those of you out there on the online environment, thank you very much for your participation and your questions. And then finally, let me thank Roger Torrendon right over there, who decided to take a chance and try to make this happen, and I think this has turned out much better than anybody could have imagined it would. So thanks a lot, Roger. It's happened. Sometimes it really works when you step out on a ledge, huh? Remember, we have archived this event, and people will be able to see it for some time. Roger will be sending out information about how people can access it. And just before the holidays, we will be sending out an evaluation form to get your feedback about this. Please try to complete that and get it back to us. Thank you. Have a great weekend.